Okay, in the interest of time, we'll jump right in.
Yay.
Thank you all for being on time. I know most of you here, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Reshma. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the Student Development and Leadership Coordinator in the Office of Student Life. Welcome to today's workshop, Overcoming Perfectionism. And today's workshop is presented by Tashelle Tanis, who is from the Counseling Center at CUNY SPS.
Hello.
Before I pass the Hello, sorry.
Sorry, I was just saying hi.
Before I pass the floor to our amazing presenter, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. Some of you know them already, but it never hurts to hear it again. Auto captions are turned on, and you can navigate through your Zoom bar to enable or disable that feature. We know that we find that cameras foster an engaging environment. So we ask that if you feel comfortable, that you do turn your cameras on. We love seeing you. And I'm sure you love seeing me as well. So, I grace you with my wonderful presence. We ask that you keep your mics muted to minimize any background noise, so that the presenter can communicate very clearly with everyone in the virtual room. You can utilize the raise your hand feature if you have any questions, or want to contribute to the discussion. Questions will be addressed at the very end if they're dropped in the chat. And finally, a considerable amount of time and effort go into organizing these programs. So we hope that you stay mentally present, and engaged with tonight's discussion, answering any questions that there may be, contemplating what this presentation tonight is about, and participating in any type of activities. And with that being said, I'll just hand it over to our presenter, Tishelle.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for the invite to present on overcoming perfectionism. Just to do a quick intro, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I work in student counseling services here at CUNY SPS. And so today, my hope for this presentation is that we learn a little bit more about perfectionism, that we're able to better identify it, and that we're also able to come away with some ways of challenging and overcoming maybe some perfectionistic behaviors or tendencies that, sometimes we engage in. So let's get right into it. All right, here we go. So first off, we should ask the question, what is perfectionism, right? So this is a very, very kind of broad way to think about it. It's an internal pressure that some people put on themselves to be and appear perfect. And oftentimes, this can be viewed as a positive trait by people because perfectionists can be successful, right? It's often seen as a trait that helps people set really high standards for themselves, that challenges themselves, encourage them to have higher levels of motivation. However, perfectionism is rooted in this really intense fear of failure or judgment or criticism. And there's a lot of self-criticism that comes with perfectionism. And ultimately, when we think about perfectionism, it's characterized by a really just unhealthy thought and behavioral patterns that create kind of what we like to call like a harsh inner critic, or kind of talking to ourselves in really critical and negative ways. And it's this harsh inner critic that basically continues to say, repeatedly says that you're not good enough, and even interprets all of your efforts to, achieve whatever you're trying to achieve, or, trying to reach a certain goal, that all of your efforts for, whatever you're trying to achieve or perfection, that is proof that you're a failure because you're not meeting perfection, right? So this harsh, really, this inner critic really can put ourselves down when we engage in perfectionistic tendencies, thoughts, and beliefs. And I just want to make a point, right, that we all live in an achievement oriented world, and we're taught to measure ourselves against like external markers of success. And this is something that I think often contributes to perfectionism, right? Like when we fall short of these expectations that are out there or that we see, we can often become really overly like self-critical. And then that can then lead to perfectionistic thinking and behaviors, which we'll talk about in a second. And so I want to kind of make this distinction, right? That a perfectionist is different from being a high achiever, okay? And my hope is that by the end of this presentation, and we can, talk about it at the end and when we have our Q&A, but my hope is that we'll have some ideas of how to be more of a high achiever as opposed to a perfectionist. So a high achiever is someone who sets consistently high standards but does not dwell on failures or mistakes. So this person is able to learn, adapt. They're able to accept any flaws, their imperfections, the mistakes that they make. They're able to stay engaged with their goals, and they're optimistic. They're able to hold optimism and hope whenever they face, something unexpected or a setback. On the other hand, perfectionists, they set extremely high, unrealistic standards for themselves, and they're preoccupied with failure, that fear of failure that I mentioned before. So they tend to fixate on the difference or the discrepancy between that unrealistic standards that they're setting for themselves and their actual performance. They tend to avoid failure at any cost. They hide mistakes out of fear. So it's really hard to actually stay engaged with the goals or the standards that they're setting for themselves. And we'll talk a little bit more like some of the behaviors that are associated with that. Again, just to kind of drill this a little bit home, that how a high achiever is different from perfectionist. So one of the these are just not an extensive list here, but just to give a better idea. So a high achiever can understand that some situations do call for perfection, but other situations don't, while a perfectionist believes everything must be perfect all the time, right? A high achiever can focus their time on the most important things that they need to do or the most important problems or tasks at hand, whereas a perfectionist tends to spend a lot of time on things that don't really matter or actually are not going to help them get to where they want to go. A high achiever can set standards for themselves that are challenging but achievable, and they feel content. They feel good when they are able to meet these challenging but achievable standards. Whereas a perfectionist sets these really impossible standards for success and then gets really, really upset when they're not able to meet these impossible standards. A high achiever is motivated by the potential for success and happiness, whereas a perfectionist is motivated by that fear of failure, criticism, and rejection, judgment, all of those things. And high achiever is able to see themselves as a multifaceted person who both has strengths and weaknesses, whereas a perfectionist sees themselves only in extreme, like they're either perfect or they're a failure. Again, just kind of, talking more about this idea of perfectionism. And I thought this was an interesting way to kind of define the different aspects of perfectionism. So we have self-oriented perfectionism. So this is a desire to be perfect in everything that you do. So this is more kind of like you yourself saying, like, I have to be perfect. I have to set these really, really high, unrealistic standards for myself. And then, getting kind of really upset or frustrated, anxious, sad, all those things when those standards aren't met. So a person who, might identify as or identify with self-oriented perfectionism, they tend to be intimidated by the goals they set because they're so unrealistic. They tend to, have a lot more hopelessness that the goals that they're setting for themselves will never become reality. And that then has, can trickle into many different problems again that we'll get to. Other oriented perfectionism. So this is someone who has high unrealistic expectations of others, right? So someone who tends to be really critical or judgmental of others. And this, means that it can be really hard to delegate work. And so you're maybe always taking things on your own, or always doing work on your own and maybe getting stressed out or burned out because of that. This affects relationships as well, difficulty working with others. And social oriented perfectionism is a belief that others have high and unrealistic expectations of you. So a person who may identify with this aspect of perfectionism would be somebody who, notices that they're really harsh or hard on themselves for what they think other people think of them, right? And their self-worth tends to be either determined or really tied up with these unrealistic high standards, whether it's cultural or societal standards. Okay, so oops, I think I just skipped a slide. How do I go back? There we go. Okay, so in order to kind of identify, if this is something that is starting to kind of sound a little bit like you, or you're maybe someone who has already identified, oh, sometimes I think I engage in some perfectionistic tendencies. I wanted to kind of go through some common like thinking errors that are associated with perfectionistic thoughts. And we'll also go over some common perfectionistic behaviors because we can't really address or work on things if we don't first identify them, right? So again, not an exhaustive list, but this is just to get people thinking to see if anything starts to sound familiar, basically. Okay. So I'll try to go through this as quick as possible. So all or nothing thinking. So that is what I just mentioned before, right? With that perfectionistic versus a high achiever, that they see themselves as either failure or perfect, right? So that is literally all or nothing thinking, where something is either right, wrong, good, bad. There's no gray area. There's no flexibility. There's nothing in between. It's all on the opposite ends of the spectrum. Having these really, really high standards, right? So setting these standards that are nearly impossible to reach. Filtering is another thinking error. So when a person only focuses on the negative details and ignores all the positive things that, might be going on in a situation or feedback or whatever, they're experiencing. Mind reading is kind of like making assumptions, right? Believing that you know what others are thinking without any concrete evidence, right? So you're assuming that you know what a person's thinking or how they're looking at you or perceiving you and treating that as a fact, basically, when you don't really have any evidence to prove that. Um, Overestimating the likelihood that a negative event is going to occur, despite whatever lots and lots of evidence that maybe you're going to be fine and you're going to do well on a task because you've done it 100 times, you're still kind of telling yourself, ooh, I'm going to fail this because that's part of how your perfectionism is coming out, right? Tunnel vision. So when you pay way too much attention to detail and then you actually lose sight of the big picture. Interpersonal sensitivity, when you're being overly concerned about the opinions of others. And this tends to look like repeatedly kind of, asking someone, hey, well, actually, it's kind of a mix, but, even though somebody might say, hey, I think you're cool, right? But you still get really, really concerned and feel that you have to be a certain way for that person to actually like you. Catastrophic thinking. This is actually a really, really big one, I think, just outside of perfectionism anyway. But this idea or belief that there's no way you would be able to cope if a negative event happened, right? So if we think about in terms of perfectionism, like if you were to make a mistake, that's kind of the end of the world. You sent an email that has a typo in it and it went to your boss, and that now your boss thinks you're, yeah, I don't know, stupid or something like that, right? So really, really kind of going to the extreme. An exaggerated sense of responsibility or need for control, right? So believing that you have more control over events than you actually do. Should statements is another big one. This happens a lot, even again, outside of perfectionism. But whenever you notice that you say the word should in any sentence, it actually would be helpful to just like take a pause and kind of think like, is there a rigid rule that I have about what I just said, because should statements tend to reflect us having internally some rigid rules about how we think things ought to be or how we've been told things ought to be. And then inappropriate comparisons, right? So comparing yourselves to others who are stronger in a particular area. So these are, again, non-extensive lists, but just some thinking errors that tend to then create these perfectionistic thoughts that contribute to perfectionism. So with thoughts, we have behaviors, right? And so again, just going to review these as quickly as possible. Overcompensating, so performing a behavior in excessive manner to ensure nothing goes wrong. Um, Excessive checking, reassurance seeking. So that one's tied to the one I was just talking about before in terms of that thinking error, right? Really feeling that you have to repeatedly check with someone or seek reassurance, even if they told you it's okay, that this can be a behavior that happens. Kind of similar to this repeating correcting, right? Going to a lot of lengths to correct a behavior, even if it's not that big of a deal. Making lots of or excessive organizing, list making. And again, that's related, I think, to the tunnel vision thinking error, right? Where you're spending so much time getting organized that you're not even doing the task that you need to do, right? Or you're not getting the things that you need to get done. It's hard to make decisions, right? When you have a fear of potentially failure and making mistakes and being criticized. So this is another perfectionistic behavior. Procrastination and avoidance. These tend to be the big two that people think of when they think about perfectionism and how it gets in their way, right? Because again, if we have this fear of failure, if we have this fear of being criticized or judged or whatever it is, then we're more likely going to put that thing off, right? We don't want to fail. We're scared of not potentially meeting that standard. So we put that thing off or we completely avoid it. And slowness is another big, actually, I would think even a consequence, right, of perfectionism because, we engage in these perfectionistic behaviors, we engage in these perfectionistic thoughts, and it makes it so, it just takes so much more time and effort to actually get the things done that we want to get done, even though we want to, do them so well, right? Not knowing when to quit and giving up too soon, right? So you continue a task way longer than makes sense, right? Than it's productive, or you even give up doing something, right? Because you're scared, right, that you're gonna fail or you're not gonna do that task well. And then these last two are more kind of related to like, others, right? So, you doing everything yourself because you don't trust others to do the task correctly or trying to change like others' behaviors, like attempting for people to do things only your way. You kind of think there's only one right way to do a certain thing when that's not true. There's many ways to do something and achieve a goal. Okay. So, with all of those things that I just breezed through really quickly, those thoughts, those behaviors comes many different problems. Okay. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these tend to be kind of the most common of problems that are associated with perfectionism. Like I mentioned, procrastination is top top of this list because all of those thoughts, those behaviors, they take it just whenever we're anxious about something or we're dreading something or we have this type of fear, it makes it super, super hard for us to engage with whatever that task, that goal, that thing we're trying to do. So procrastination is a big one and avoidance is a big one. It can affect relationships, right? It's going to be hard to feel comfortable being open and honest with others if you're afraid of being criticized. If you have unrealistic expectations of others, right, that's going to impact how you interact with other people. That harsh inner critic, right, that we talked about, if you think about kind of those thinking errors as well, it really does put a person down, right? It kind of makes them feel, unfortunately, like really bad about themselves, right? Um, Limited life experience of life. If you're someone who identifies with having that fear of failure or being criticized or, not being able to, pick up something fast or whatever it is, it's going to be probably harder for you to be open to new experiences or challenge yourself to do new things because there's this fear of, not doing it well or failing and things like that. And unfortunately, all these things that I'm talking about, the behaviors and the thoughts, right, that creates stress, right? That makes life things really stressful. That then triggers a lot of things physically, right? That happens in our body whenever we experience stress. And if this goes on for a long time, chronic stress, like those things really do impact different systems in our body. So it can potentially, cause physical health problems. Um, I was talking about how procrastination and avoidance and slowness and all these things are associated with perfectionism. And, this is one of the problems that happens, right? That we actually have difficulty achieving the goals that we're setting for ourselves, even if it's a reasonable goal, but we're engaging in perfectionistic thoughts or perfectionistic behaviors. It's going to be really hard to achieve that goal. It's going to take us much longer and have lots of stress, right? So, another issue that can come up. And then, perfectionism is associated with, mental health symptoms like anxiety, low mood, sadness, OCD, and things like that. Okay, so I just said all these things about what perfectionism is and, how we can identify it. So let's move into how does one start to kind of move away from perfectionism and move more towards being a high achiever. Okay, so let's get into it. All right. So the first thing that I think is really important is to like actually have some buy-in, right, for yourself to say, you know what, I think I do want to change how I'm thinking and behaving in this regard. Okay. And one of the ways you can kind of get this buy-in for yourself and get that commitment for yourself is to kind of do a cost benefit analysis. Like identify what are the ways that you're thinking are, what are those perfectionistic maybe thoughts and behaviors that you notice that you engage in maybe often or even a lot, right? Once you identify those things, start to think about like, how are these things impacting my life, right? Is it actually impacting my school? Is it impacting work, my relationship, my health, you know? And, you know, I hope if you decide to do this, right, that once you start to kind of, you know, reflect in this way, you might start to realize, you know, the perceived kind of like benefits of perfectionism might actually not be worth it, right? That, you know, pushing yourself in this way and motivating yourself by kind of putting yourself down might actually be having a negative impact on multiple areas of your life. And maybe there's another way that you can motivate yourself and be a high achiever, right? So this is one of the ways to kind of just kind of do that first step to think about and identify what's going on, how is this impacting you, and do you want to change it? And I hope the answer would be yes. um, so, you know, generally when we're thinking about shifting away from, you know, perfectionism and moving maybe more towards being a high achiever, we have to adjust how we're mentally approaching the standards that we set for ourselves, the goals that we set for ourselves, and all of that. And so, you know, I'm going to start by just kind of generally saying like it's important to start thinking about how to adjust your mindset, how you're mentally approaching things. First things first, there's no such thing as perfection. There's no such thing as perfectionism, okay? It is an illusion, it's super subjective, it's not realistic. Everyone makes mistakes. We are all human beings, right? And as human beings, we are imperfect. And also, you can also think about, you know, when we think about the word mistake or making a mistake, I think there's a lot of negative connotation to mistakes. And it's not all negative when we make mistakes. Mistakes are actually essential for growth, for learning, for change, for actually reaching whatever goal or standard we're trying to set for ourselves. We have to make mistakes here and there because it is important for us to learn and grow. So I want to nail that home as much as possible. Perfection is not a thing. No one's perfect. It is not attainable. Okay. Lowering the stakes for yourself. So what I mean by this does not mean that you have to like lower your quality of work or even, you know, lower in terms of like goals or whatever you're setting for yourself. It's about how you're mentally approaching your goals, your standards, and things like that, right? And so you can kind of think about it like when I was describing the high achiever and the perfectionist, right? Perfectionist is a person who's setting these super high, unrealistic standards for themselves. So we want to lower the stakes to be a high achiever who sets, you know, high or challenging standards for ourselves, but it's attainable, right? That's the key is that when we're lowering the stakes, we're thinking about, okay, is this something that feels doable, realistic for me, and that I can make, you know, thoughtful, intentional steps towards a certain goal? And again, you know, adjusting how maybe you're perceiving, thinking, maybe assuming things of others, right? You know, trying to be, you know, maybe a little less critical of others. Not only can this just improve all of your relationships, but it can reduce that fear, right, of being criticized and judged by others or being seen as a failure. Okay. So, in the effort of shifting our mindset, right, again, away from perfectionism, more towards being a high achiever, it is so important to focus on the process of striving for success. What tends to happen with perfectionism is that a person is saying, I want to reach this goal. This goal is really big. And, you know, I have to be perfect. I have to do all these things in order to reach this goal. And it's really, really rigid. And all they're focusing is on that end goal. And then they get anxious or overwhelmed because they're not sure how to reach the goal and that they feel that they have to be perfect. So even as I'm talking about what happens, you can see that you can kind of get stuck in this loop where not much gets done or it takes a long time to get done because there's so much focus on the end goal and that being this perfect idea of perfectionism or success, right? So a high achiever, what they tend to do is that they place their focus on the process of getting towards a goal, right? And when you focus on the process, the steps or the tasks that it takes to achieve a set, a goal that you're setting for yourself, it allows you, one, to stay engaged with the goal, right? So you're reducing avoidance, you're reducing procrastination, you're reducing some of those perfectionistic behaviors that I talked about before. You tend to be less critical of yourself because as you focus on the process, that feels much better than this huge, lofty goal, right? That you're focusing on. When you're thinking about you want to get an A in a class and you're only focused on that, that's going to feel like a lot and really difficult. But if you think about, oh, to get an A, I have to study or I have to do my discussion board post, that feels a little bit more doable, right? And when you do your discussion board post, you're like, yay, I did that, right? So you feel better about yourself. So as you think and you focus more on the process, you're eventually able to reach that goal, right? And it makes it feel way less stressful and it, reduces some of those perfectionistic thinking and behaviors and it allows you to hopefully achieve the goal that you're or standard that you're setting for yourself. Okay, so again, just kind of trying to, nail home this idea of focusing on the process and not, the goal, right? Being more process oriented instead of goal oriented. So, completing any goal, trying to reach any standard that you're setting for yourself, whatever it is, remember it's going to take time and it's always, always, always going to be an imperfect process. You're going to make mistakes, you're going to have setbacks. That's unfortunately life, right? Unexpected things are going to happen. And so important to just come to a place to accept that as you're working towards something, it's going to take time. There's going to be steps to get there, and it's going to be imperfect. There's going to be things that happen. There's going to be mistakes that's made. We always want to make sure that when you're thinking about that goal, right, how do you get there and you're focusing on the process, do your best to break that goal into whatever realistic steps will take you to get to that goal. Um, Time management techniques are really like helpful for this process or this building up the skill. I put here the Pomodoro method because I think it's one of the more more well-known, but I think easier ways to kind of or time management tools or techniques that helps a person focus more on the process as opposed to being goal-oriented. Because you have to break things down into little steps that you can do in 25 minutes and all of that. So I think this can be a really, hopefully helpful way to kind of, be a little bit more focused on the process instead of goal-oriented. Um, and this next point in terms of tracking your time, I also think this is really important as you're thinking about how do I focus more on my process, right? How do I focus more on the steps I need to take to reach a goal? It is important to know how long it takes us to do things. Sometimes we overestimate, sometimes we underestimate. And, if you're consistently overestimating things, that means you're more likely to avoid doing that thing because you're like, it's going to take me all day when maybe it might only take like 2 hours, right? When we underestimate or consistently underestimate how long it might take us to do something, we then end up unfairly criticizing ourselves because it takes us an hour instead of 30 minutes to actually, read that paper that we need to read, right? So it's important to make sure that you're thoughtful and mindful about like where your strengths and weaknesses are, and also when you're, how long it takes you to do things. Social support is super, super helpful for like many things in life. But I think it's also really helpful when it comes to perfectionism and trying to focus on the process and, being more of a high achiever as opposed to a perfectionist, right? You'll be able to kind of see and observe how other people have, worked towards a similar goal or as they're working towards a similar goal. You might see how they deal with mistakes, right? They might be able to support you when you make a mistake or you have a setback, right? So I think it's important to, if you feel so inclined to maybe join a group or, meet with other people, right, who are also trying to achieve the same goal that you're setting for yourself. Um, I think self-reflection is really helpful. And when you're focusing on the process, and maybe that's just the therapist in me, but journaling, documenting how it's going for you, right? As you're trying to focus on each step that you're doing, as you're trying to focus on, doing your best with, your discussion board post and all of those things so you can get that A, right? to kind of check in with yourself. How's this feeling for you to focus more on the process instead of, focusing rigidly on that A, right? Are there things that you're learning about yourself? Are there things that's unexpected, right? I think it's important to make sure that you're checking in with yourself as you are trying to adjust how you're thinking and approaching things and trying to shift your mindset. Okay, so we were talking about the process, right? That does not mean we forget about goals. It's we all have goals. We should have goals. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But we want to make sure that whatever goals that you're setting for yourself, that they are realistic. Okay, we want to make sure that when we're thinking about what goals we're setting for ourselves, or even if it's a standard or something that you're setting for yourself, are there steps that will help you to get to that standard or goal, right? Are the steps to get to that goal also realistic, right? So we want to make sure that we're doing that, being really intentional about when we're setting goals for ourselves, if it makes sense and how do we get there, and making sure that those steps to get there are realistic. And I have here adjusting your goals to be realistic is key, right? It really, really, really is key. One of the main differences when in that description between a high achiever and a perfectionist is that a high achiever, again, sets goals that are challenging for themselves, but they are attainable and they are reasonable and they're realistic. So this is very much a key, right? When you're setting goals for yourself, just double check, take stock of what's going on in your life, what you have, what responsibilities you have, and all of that, your strengths, your limitations, and say, is this goal that I have does it really make sense? Is it really realistic? So once you feel that your goals are realistic and you're thinking about what steps you need to take, right, you want to make sure that those steps to get to your goal, that you're really focusing on the things that are important, right? One of the things that perfectionists do is that they focus on things that don't really actually help them, right? And don't really actually get them to where they want to be. So you want to make sure that you're being really thoughtful and intentional about actually putting your attention, focus, and energy where it counts, right? And again, here's another time management tool, because again, I think time management tools are like super helpful for this process of shifting towards being a high achiever. And I forgetting the name of this matrix. I think it's like Eisenhower matrix, but basically this is how a way to prioritize tasks, right? Even as you're thinking about your goal and how to get there, that this is a way that you can organize and prioritize what are the things that you need to do first, what are the things that you need to schedule to do, what are the things that you need to delegate, and what are the things that you kind of don't do or that you put to the side, right? We want to make sure that your goal is smart and that the tasks to get to your goal or the steps to get to your goal are also smart. So is it specific? Is it something that's measurable? Is it something that's attainable? Is it something that's realistic? Is it something that's time bound? Um, Another way to kind of think about how you adjust your goals is to do something, I call it hypothesis testing kind of, but it's kind of like testing yourself, right? Run a little small experiment and test how necessary it is to utilize maybe a perfectionistic behavior or thought pattern that you've been doing, right? Kind of challenge yourself and ask a question like, what would it be like? What would happen if I delegated like a low risk task to, my family member once a week or something like that? What would happen if, I studied for 30 minutes less, each day because I need time to take care of myself or, do something else, right? Just kind of test these things out and see, how much you really need to hold rigidly to a certain behavior or way of thinking. And this can also help you adjust how realistic your goals are or your standards are that you're setting for yourself. I mentioned this before, but I also think observing others is a really helpful way as well to kind of evaluate your goals. Like, I would hope or I would assume, right? We've all experienced people who have made mistakes and we've seen them make mistakes, right? And think about and observe, like, oh, how did they respond to that mistake, right? How did I think about that mistake, right? Um, you know, is it when people see imperfect work, right? Like, how do they respond? Kind of start to think about, like, is it really, that serious, or are the consequences of maybe making a mistake or just accepting and learning from a mistake, is it really that negative? So I think it's important to also try to observe, kind of test yourself, as you're trying to evaluate your goals or the standards that you're setting for yourself, especially if this is, if you're identifying that you want to be more towards a high achiever versus a perfectionist. Okay, so a big, big part of perfectionism, as I mentioned, right, is that harsh inner critic that I talked about, right? So this is really, really important when it comes to overcoming and challenging perfectionism, is addressing that harsh inner critic and trying to, get them to like be as quiet as possible, right? And so how we do that, this is an active process. I can't emphasize this enough, right? It's not just passively, catching a thought here and there. This is something where with intention, you're saying, I'm gonna, pay attention to how I'm thinking. I'm gonna try to reflect on what my thoughts are or what I'm saying to myself and try to really identify what are these thinking errors potentially, right, that I'm using to put myself down. In some ways you can do that, if you have, if it's possible for you, right, you can kind of record them or jot them down maybe in your phone as they come into your head. If that's not possible, right, you can try to say a few times a week that you're going to sit down for a few minutes, doesn't have to be a long time, maybe 5 minutes or something like that, and just reflect and think, when are those times this week that I felt like, I hadn't done it well enough, or I felt like I failed, or I felt really, really hard on myself, or I was really, really down. And try to reflect and remember, what was I thinking at that time? What thinking errors might I've been using, right, to kind of put myself down. And so once you're able to start identifying maybe some of this negative self-talk, as we call it, right? But these negative thoughts, evaluate it, put it under a microscope, right? We don't want to just let those thoughts run wild and have free reign in your mind. We want to challenge those thoughts, right? If you have a thought, trying to think of one that I said already, right? If I think that my boss thinks I'm, a horrible hire and stupid because I had a typo in my email that I checked multiple times, right? Is there evidence for that thought, for that belief that my boss thinks I'm, not smart or whatever it is? Do I really have evidence for that? Am I jumping to maybe a negative conclusion here without enough evidence with that thought? Is there any other way that I can look at this situation? If I were to be positive about this, this situation and me putting this typo in the email, how would I view this, right? What would be another way I can interpret this? Will this mistake really matter a year from now, 5 years from now, right? That it's important to kind of really evaluate these thoughts, and the more that we kind of question and challenge these thoughts, the more that we get to realize, oh wait, like me assuming that my boss thinks I'm not smart is actually, there's no evidence for that, right? Actually, I got good feedback that they think I'm a great coworker or worker or whatever, right? So, this can be really, really helpful to challenging that harsh inner critic so we can lower their volume in our mind. Some other ways to deal with that harsh inner critic, especially with perfectionism, you're gonna naturally look for mistakes, right? And so anytime you identify something that's negative or you're putting yourself down, right? Challenge yourself. Say, okay, I'm thinking that, I don't know how to proofread an email and I'm only focused on that. But you know what? I think I can identify two positives, right? I wrote two paragraphs in that email and everything else is fine, right? And I got a reply back, and it seemed like my boss was able to understand exactly what I said. So those are two positive things, right? So kind of getting into the practice of challenging and, actually reminding yourself that everything's not all negative, that you don't have to be perfect, right? And that you are actually doing things well. Um, Try to come up with more adaptive and positive statements to actually replace those negative thoughts that come up for you. And so positive self-talk is literally the opposite, right, of negative self-talk. And it can be a really helpful tool to interrupt, like when we get into maybe a perfectionistic loop and we're kind of ruminating and using thinking errors or getting stuck or feeling like we're procrastinating, that, if we're able to identify what's going on and say, take a pause and actually try to, with intention and with effort, start using positive self-talk, it can interrupt that cycle, that rumination, And actually, the more that you practice positive self-talk, the more that we start to internalize those statements and things like that, the more we start to believe them. And so if you decide that you want to create some positive statements for yourself, these are just some, some guidelines to create those statements. If you decide to do this, I advise, write these statements when you're kind of like at baseline or you're kind of feeling neutral or content. It's going to be really, really hard to access or to try to write positive statements when you're already feeling you're in the thick of feeling really anxious or feeling really down on yourself. It's going to be hard to do that. So if you decide to do this, I say, try to sit down and do this when, you're feeling okay. Um, and, write these statements down, have them somewhere where it's easily accessible or you see them a lot, right? And as I mentioned, the more that you practice this positive self-talk, these positive statements, the more that we internalize them and they can actually replace that negative self-talk. These are just some examples for like positive self-talk, like statements or things like that, that can kind of replace some of those negative self-talk or negative thoughts that might come up for you. So let's see, let me pick out some to just read off here. I trust in my ability to handle challenges with grace and resilience. That's a good one. I do my best and then I move on. Let's see. I save my energy for things that matter most to me. Mistakes enable me to learn and grow, right? So these are kind of like in a way like affirmations, kind of, right? But again, the more that you practice these type of statements and you repeat them and maybe every day or multiple times a day, right? The more that we internalize it and can hopefully replace those negative ways of thinking about ourselves. Okay, and my last tip for, working through and hopefully overcoming perfectionism is practicing mindfulness, actually. So mindfulness is basically an ability to pay attention in the present moment in a very specific way. So paying attention to the present moment with intention, without judgment, and with openness and curiosity, right? And the reason I'm suggesting mindfulness as another kind of tool to help with perfectionism is that we all pretty much operate on autopilot most of the time, right? This autopilot mode filters out a lot of information in our day to day. It actually helps us to get things done, right? Because we don't have, our brain doesn't get overwhelmed with all the information that we take in all the time or that we experience. But this autopilot mode, even though it filters out things we don't necessarily need to attend to, it also filters out things that we should attend to, right? Such as how we're feeling moment to moment, right? Um, how we might be thinking about or assessing a certain situation that might be triggering perfectionistic thoughts or behaviors, right? And so the more that you practice mindfulness, the more you're able to be more like aware of how you're thinking, how you're feeling, how you might be responding to a situation. And so I think it can be a really helpful tool to actually just be able to identify when you might get stuck in a perfectionistic kind of loop or rumination cycle, and reduce that stress that comes with being stuck in a cycle, and helps us refocus our attention, right? So we can do what we need to do, or focus more on that process as we're working towards a goal. And here are just some common like mindfulness, exercises or techniques like yoga, guided meditation, like gratitude journaling, deep breathing. There are many different mindfulness techniques, but I feel like these are some of the most kind of like the easier ones. And actually, we're, little plug here, but counseling's doing a mindfulness workshop this Thursday at 12. So you all are free to join. And I think we're doing a guided meditation this Thursday. So that can be, another way to, start kind of practicing on your mindfulness is attending some. I know there's other workshops too for meditation and mindfulness. So this is another resource for you guys. And so we're at the end here. So just a quick overview, because I know I said a lot. And so as we've been talking about, right, this perfectionism is this internal pressure that some people put on themselves to be and appear perfect, and it causes, a lot of unhealthy thought behavioral patterns that create this harsh inner critic, right? That really puts us down. It, triggers these behavioral patterns that really get in our way, can cause a lot of, difficulties. across different areas of our life. And so some of the things that I mentioned in terms of ways to challenge and overcome perfectionism, first things first, like I mentioned, we have to identify things in order to improve or work on them, right? So that's always going to be number one. Identify how you're thinking, identify how you're behaving. Once you identify those things, try to think about how it's impacting your life, right? Are these things, causing a lot of distress? Because if they are, then, I think we should put some thought and effort and time into working, on those things and hopefully improving those things, those thoughts and behaviors. Um, Make sure that you adjust your mindset, right? Remembering that perfection is an illusion, right? That you can lower the stakes. It doesn't have to be so high, right? In order for you to be a high achiever and achieve your goals. Focusing on the process, right? Being more process oriented as opposed to goal oriented. And again, that does not mean that we're not setting goals for ourselves. That does not mean that we are not setting challenging, even high achieving goals for ourselves, but we're making sure that we're focusing on the steps more so we can stay engaged with our goals, so we can actually achieve the goals that we want, and that we're making sure that the goals that we're setting for ourselves are realistic and make sense and are attainable, and that they're smart goals, right? Um, and then the next really big thing, right, is really trying to challenge that harsh inner critic, identifying how you're talking to yourself, right? What are these thoughts that are coming up for you when you're starting to feel like you're a failure or that you're just not doing well and all of those things? How are you thinking to yourself? How are you putting yourself down? And then examine those thoughts. We got to identify and challenge those thoughts and really put them under a microscope so we can see and recognize that these thoughts that come to our mind, it's not really based in reality, right? um, Practice positive self-talk, right? This is, I think, can be really, really helpful to lower the volume on that harsh inner critic that we have, right? The more that you practice speaking positively to yourself, reminding yourself of your strengths and things like that, the more it becomes internalized. And then, the last kind of tip that I mentioned was mindfulness, right? How it can help you identify and actually interrupt, some of the perfectionistic tendencies that can happen. And I think, yes. And then, so that's the last slide. This is, contact information for student counseling services. We offer free confidential mental health support for enrolled SPS students. So this is our contact number or contact info here if anyone's ever interested in reaching out to us. And some additional mental health resources. These are also free and confidential resources. They're available 24/7. Can call, text, chat. If you just are having a rough time, you just want to talk to someone, or even if you want to get resources, we can be really, really, really helpful. And oh, these are all the resources that we use for this presentation. And then let's open it up for questions. Thank you so much. I know a lot of talking and a lot of information. So hopefully I'll do my best to answer whatever questions anyone has.
Yeah, I think we have Angela.
Uh,
Can you hear me okay?
yes.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to say thank you so much for the session. It was so insightful and so helpful. For the past couple of weeks, I felt like I was like in this weird stuck place. And now I
Mm,
understand that my level of perfectionism was so high, it kept me from doing anything. So now I feel less overwhelmed and more like, I got this. I'll be all right. Like, I'll be
you
okay.
got
So
this.
just thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes. Focus on the process. I think that that's probably where you're getting stuck, is that you're focusing on the end. Think about the steps. Focus more on that. You're going to feel better about yourself, and you're going to get to where you need to be.
Thank you, Angela. Just so you know, this session is not only for questions, but compliments as well. So thank you, Angela. Caro.
Yes, good afternoon again, everybody. This was so helpful. Today is my off day, and I absolutely did nothing today because I felt debilitated,
Oh,
immobilized. And it was to the point that I was saying, you know what, I'm gonna just drop this specific course that's just stressing me out. And I'm glad that I was able to sit with this today because being able to identify perfectionism tendencies versus high achiever, and I
Mhm.
think the lines can be blurred if you're not clear about, defining it, right? And I
Right.
find that I was blurring the lines. For a very, very long time and not realizing it. And I think today was just one of those days where everything just came to head. Because even today,
Mhm.
I was gonna kind of reach a direction. I don't know if I could make it today. Because
Mhm.
mentally, I'm just zapped, like literally, like just out of it. But I'm glad that I attended. I've gotten so much sources to kind of like dive into and realize that, oh, I just need to shift the way that I am looking at the bigger picture, you know what I
Mm.
mean? Think
Right.
about the process
Mm.
and not the goal all the time, because you're going to
Right.
meet the goal if you keep working the process eventually.
Right. Right.
That's an automatic. And I think at
Mhm.
the moment, like it all just, at least for the last couple of weeks, this semester has just been a really hard one for me with classes. But in terms of just, and I think this is what I needed to just kind of like, oh, to realign, like, and
Mhm.
decipher like where am I operating from. So Tashelle, thank you so much. And Rashma, I mean, you're the best for organizing this and bringing this to us. And now I have stuff to share with my mentees. So thank you.
And
Thank you, Akara.
can I
Yes.
just add to that? Yes to all of that. And also sometimes like we just need a break. So I want you to be thoughtful about not criticizing, maybe just needing a day to like reorient yourself, okay? So just wanted to put that out there that sometimes we get overwhelmed, we need that day, and that's okay.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah. This came in at the best time that I can never. It's the gift that
Oh,
I
I'm so
didn't
glad.
ask for. So thank you.
Lewis.
Hi, Reshma. Um, I want to say this was an excellent workshop and like I'm so glad I attended it. I want to just say as someone with anxiety and ADHD, a lot of the symptoms of perfectionism intertwine with those aforementioned
Mhm.
issues that I have. So like I
Mhm.
couldn't believe it. I honestly like thought they were separate, but I'm glad that like, you know, but
Yeah.
I'm just like shocked. Like I couldn't believe like all the stuff I was reading about like the symptoms of perfectionism. I'm like, wow,
Mhm.
that's like me. And like it put a lot of unnecessary stress on me and like especially in one of my classes that like I'm not particularly enjoying, but I have no choice but to take it and I'm
Mhm.
struggling with it. So like after like this whole workshop, like I'm not as intimidated to like do the assignments anymore, stuff like
Yay.
that. And like I'm gonna try harder this time. And like now I know that like everything will be all right. I just got to be realistic and just stay the heck away from perfectionism.
I
Say
mean,
no.
I wish it were that easy, but yes, it takes time and effort, right, to kind of shift away from, this way of thinking. So we don't want to set unrealistic standards, right? That we're going to say, oh,
Yeah,
not going to be a perfectionist, and then it doesn't automatically happen. So I want to be careful of that. And also, you're correct. You're right that a lot of things, I think, just generally with mental health, right, tend to have a lot of overlapping stuff, right?
yeah,
Where one can be, anxious and then that leads to perfectionism or vice versa, right? And things like that. So there's a lot of things that interact with each other and overlap. And
mhm,
I'm glad to hear that you were able to identify some things that it sounds like you that sound familiar for you, right? And
very.
I want to, encourage you just be patient, compassionate as you, if you decide, right, to kind of work towards, shifting how you're thinking or approaching things because it doesn't happen automatically. That's why I said, it's not a passive process. It's about, it takes effort, it takes time, it's
Yeah,
hard. Okay.
Thank
yeah,
you, Lewis and Tashelle. The irony is, some of us may walk away saying, I'll become perfect at overcoming perfectionism.
Right, right.
Um,
Don't want that. Don't want that.
Oh, quickly, thanks to Carl for the kind words. I just saw your comment. Um,
Charmaine. Yeah. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Like Rushma, I have to get going. Sorry, Charmaine.
Thanks for joining, Lewis.
Okay, take care, guys.
Charmaine, you have the floor.
I just wanted to say thank you because prior to this meeting, I was freaking out over a group project, being that 2 out of 5 of us are responsive and communicative, and we're missing our other 3 people, which caused my anxiety to spike and his anxiety to spike, and then our anxieties blended together and created a super anxiety, and we were going nowhere really fast. And so my energy is now depleted, and everything that I shouldn't be doing, I was doing until this meeting. And now I realize, okay, I better reference every point that you emphasized during this meeting to have a better tomorrow as opposed to the freak out that I was having today. So I just wanted to thank you. And sorry about my 3-year-old.
No problem. And a big part of working on things, right, is that, we're gonna experience kind of how'd you say it? The super anxiety storm, right? We're gonna experience it, right? But after it happens, as long as we're able to sit and identify, right, what happened and learn from it, we don't criticize it, we don't judge it, right? We say this happened. Maybe I don't like that it happened, but it happened. How can I maybe reduce how long I'm in that anxiety storm next time, right? So again, I want to be careful of, putting criticism onto,
I
what you're
appreciate that
experiencing.
definitely.
Thank you, Charmaine. Thank you to Shell. Charmaine, when you mentioned the storm of anxiety, it reminded me of Inside Out 2. For those of you who haven't seen it, amazing movie.
Right.
Definitely a good movie
It's
for
an
this
amazing
year, this
movie.
generation. Um, maybe we should like do a watch party for that one. Um, Shanice, tell us your thoughts.
Hi. I just wanted to thank you for this because I have been struggling these past few weeks with my assignments because of the whole perfectionism thing. It's like this doesn't sound right. This paper isn't going to do well, and then I freeze and then I do nothing.
Mhm.
So I'm like I'm struggling in that situation. So I'm thankful for this presentation because it provided me some clarity. So now I have some ways to approach my assignments a little easier and to give myself some grace in that time.
Thank
And
you.
can I just emphasize this idea that comes with challenging perfectionism and being a high achiever? Um, Sometimes good and done is good enough, right? Just finishing the assignment, getting it done, it being good enough, that's all you need to do.
Thank you, Shanice and Tashel. Azan, am I saying that correctly? I apologize if I kind of butchered your name a bit.
Fine. Well, I kind of enjoyed this session because, like, sometimes what happens to me, I'm also struggling with anxiety issues too. Because sometimes, like, what happens to me, like, when I get a question on the dot sometimes about something related to my work, I sometimes, like, I'm afraid sometimes I take the time to process information, but I usually get afraid of being wrong.
Yeah. And, you know, I think that's a very human experience, right? As much as I think we all are talking and thinking about, right, like how not to fall into like these little traps of perfectionism. But I do think that it happens, right? Well, especially when it comes to work in school, when you're actually being evaluated for your performance, right? That I think it's natural to have some of these concerns. And some of the ways to kind of maybe not totally get rid of the fear, but minimize it as much as we can is to hopefully remind yourself, I'm doing the best that I can. I have done the best that I can, right? And my best is good enough. So it's kind of some of that positive self-talk that I was talking about before.
Thank you. Akaro.
Oh yes, I wanted to kind of piggyback on what she had said too, and I think this is something that I think sometimes we have like what last semester was what your best was, it may look different this semester. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? And so, and then a lot of times, like I know for me, let me speak to me. I measure myself on my last performance, and it have a lot to do with the work that I've done over the years, personally, professionally. Like I'm a performer. Well, I used to perform, but I teach now, and I used to say I am just as good as my last performance. So if that didn't go well, that could very well mess up the opportunity of what could come in the future. And I
Mm-hmm.
think sometimes I fall into that space again, even especially being in academia, even though I think some professors they do a little bit too much with the workload, but conversation for another day. But I think that too, like once something is completed, like how you say a few moments ago, good and done is good enough, and holding that truth. I think that when you said that, that just kind of like burst inside of me. And I'm like, you know what? That's what I'm going to start doing, because sometimes I would have an assignment. It's due on Sunday. I'm going to finish it either today or tomorrow. And then it's just waiting there. And I'm looking at it every day, like, why am I not submitting this?
Right.
And
Right.
then I'm have anxiety the entire
Mm-hmm.
week. And then Sunday shows up, and now I have no choice but to submit it
Right.
before the time. You know what I mean? So at least I can get the grade. And I'm looking, what else can I say? What else can I do to make it right? You know? But that one and done.
Mm-hmm.
Good and done, not one and done, good and done.
Good and done.
I have to remind myself of that and
Mm-hmm.
void and divorce myself from what the successes look like because it's already past and gone. And I still gotta move forward. So thanks for that
Mm-hmm.
again. Yeah.
Yeah. And another, I guess, kind of tip. I don't know if it's so much with perfectionism, but just based on what you describe, what you experience, um, if you are encountering something that you are avoiding or procrastinating and you're putting it off, and you look at your to-do list for the day, make that thing the first thing that you do before anything. I mean, obviously, get ready for your day and all that, but it's the first thing you do. If you do that, even if it maybe takes you, you know, 30 minutes longer to do the thing because, you don't like it, whatever it is, at least you get it done. And then you have all that mental space and you feel hopefully better about yourself, but you have all that mental space to do all the other things you need to do. Because when we're putting something off, it's still in our mind as you described. And then we're distracted and it might take us longer to do other things. So we have even less time to do the thing that we're dreading. So it's just a tip that like it will help to just do that thing first, even if you know it's gonna take a while or it's gonna be really hard, get it out of the way. I promise it will be help that will help.
Thank you, Tashelle. Angela.
I just wanted to say to Azan that he was concerned about having the wrong answer or doing something wrong at work. I always say to myself, I've done the best job that I can with the tools that I have. It might just be at that moment, that's what you know, but it doesn't mean that that's what you'll only know. Like that's what you knew at the moment. And maybe tomorrow you might learn something new and you'll have different info, but just give yourself grace and say, I did the best I could with the tools that I had at that time. And I find that it helps, although woulda, shoulda, coulda, anxiety about all the things.
Mhm.
Thanks,
I
Angela.
I want to emphasize that as much as possible, by the way. Okay. Very true.
Azan.
Yeah. Sometimes I also like when I'm doing an exam, for example. Like I'm doing an exam, then I'm clicking it, then I'm trying, then it's done, and I have to submit the answer. I tend to get very like scared that I panic twice. That oh, what would happen? Like what would happen?
Mhm.
That because I'm worried about the grade and everything like that. Because that also
Right,
comes in.
right, right. So again, I mean, obviously this is easier said than done, right? Like when you're in the
Yeah.
middle of it and you're panicking, right? But this is why I'm saying practicing speaking to yourself in a certain way, especially when you're not in the midst of a anxiety attack or panic, right? Helps
Yeah.
you in these moments when your anxiety gets really high, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Reminding yourself outside of a test situation, outside of maybe a situation where you're actually being evaluated, that I know that I'm putting in my effort. I know that I'm trying my best. I know
Mm.
that, fill in the blank, right? But those are kind of the key things. So I want to encourage you, try to continue practicing talking to yourself in a nice and loving and compassionate way, especially even when you feel great. Because the more you do that, the easier it's going to be, more accessible in these moments, and you hopefully won't feel as panicked when you're in those type of situations. Okay.
Thank you. Diana.
I want to thank you all for this workshop because it's come at a good time for me. I've been struggling with insomnia, and that, as you know, makes everything worse. And I was ready to drop out. And it's my last year, my last course. So I have, it's my perfectionism, and it's exactly what it is. If I can't do it 100%, then I
Mm,
have to quit. And that's so not true. And I thank you
right.
for the reminder that the positive self-talk is really what I need to start doing again. Because I used to do
Mm,
it, and I used to do a lot of things, but I mean that's something that I need to start doing to see if I could get back to that high achiever as opposed to where I am now is just the perfectionist. Um,
mhm.
so thank you very much.
Of course. And I hope you stick it out, especially since you're so close.
I know I'm
Um,
so close. How
yeah.
could I even
And
think of dropping out?
right, right. And something that came to mind as you were describing it is that, you know, when we think about shifting mindset when it comes to perfectionism, right? I think that maybe applies a little bit to where you're at, right? That this is your last class. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to
This is
be
my last class,
it
my
doesn't have to be an
intern.
A. It can be maybe a B, right? Or whatever, right? You shoot
I
for what
struggle
you
with
want to
that.
shoot for, right? But
Yeah,
that, just I'm throwing it out there to kind of
yeah,
also think about mentally how you're approaching the
yes.
class and what is like necessary, right, for you to stick it out, right? That I think if you think a little bit about it, you might find that there's more wiggle room and flexibility that might help you feel like you can stick it out for the next, what is it, 2 months, right?
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. Akaro.
Yes, I'm sorry. I have a lot to say because this has been a crazy day. But I also think too, like being an adult learner and you're coming in and you've already kind of have like so much life experience and then you're coming into academia. It isn't the fact that you don't want to do the work. You just want to
Right.
do well to keep elevating yourself because that's why we're here to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And then because I know sometimes within myself, I think I don't want a professor to think that I'm wasting his or her time. And then I've also experienced backlash of asking questions and then via email, right? Because that's the first line of defense to connect with a professor or their office hours. And then you get a question, instead of getting an answer, a direct answer to the question, you get something like, oh, but did you read the syllabus? Bear in mind, we're already in week 5 or week 6. Clearly, if this is my first time asking a question, that should tell you that I've read the syllabus or I know enough about it. So something might have just been a slight oversight. And now you're waiting. The turnover time adds even more pressure to the anxiety. And it's like, oh God, how am I going to get this? And then because you cannot really move forward unless you get that response because you want to make
Mm-hmm.
sure that you're clear about what the moving forward looks like. Other than that,
Right, right.
you don't want to take steps and then realize you got to revert all the way back again to start over again because you honestly don't have time. Like I work full time, you know what I mean? The days I have off is assigned to certain school assignments,
Right.
and even time that I don't have to give to school assignments, I'm still trying to give it. So it's like, and so all of that I think adds to the fact that we deal as I'm speaking for myself and maybe other adult learners might be experiencing this, dealing with that high level of anxiety. Like I've I've experienced insomnia like at most nights now because I'm staying up late and I cannot go to bed until I figure this out, right? And then even when I close, I'm not sleeping well, and then I'm getting up early because I got to start the day over again. So you're in autopilot mode, and it's kind of like, but you become more and more zombified day by day, and it's like, and then wanting to do well too, because I think there's that thing on the inside of you where you're like, you know what, if I'm gonna do this, I want to do it to the best of my ability. You
Of
know what I
course.
mean? Yeah, and
Yeah.
do well,
Hmm.
even without having to think about, well, ensuring your professors them know, right? Because it falls down on you, and it's kind of
Hmm.
like, ugh. So combating this is it's going to be a challenge, but I feel like you've given us so much resources today and information on identifying, well, what the triggers are and how to, in some ways, kind of remedy some of this stuff. But I think
Hmm.
that in itself adds to the pressure of, like even with Diana, I believe I'm saying it right. This being her last year, like I'm sure she wants to finish well,
Right.
for herself.
Right.
Like, yeah, the degree is gonna happen. That's gonna happen. I think
Right.
we're all clear about that. But how we're finishing too, because it just adds that extra layer of wow, I did it. But yeah, this thing, academia is hard, man. You do
It
this
is.
thing whilst you're younger when you don't think about whether you get an A or B or C. I passed the class, what's on the test, and then boop, let's go on to the next. Anyway, but that's my spiel for the rest of the night. Thank you so much.
No.
Thanks, Akara. Wanda.
Hi. First of all, I already said thank you in the chat, but I wanted to say thank you to both the Shell and also to Reshma. This was brilliant. I have really learned so much within the presentation as well as listening to everyone. And for me, I just wanted to also mention, I think setting limits, not knowing your boundaries or your limits
Mhm.
is huge plus for um perfectionism, because sometimes people put these like pressure on you to be perfect.
Mhm.
They know that you can do everything, or they think you can do everything, but you don't, and you feel like you're in this bubble that I don't want to make somebody think that I don't know it or I can't do it. So you try to be there for everyone. And I'm noticing since I've been back in school, it's like everyone calls me. They want to talk to me. They want to go out.
I see.
And it's like learning the word no.
Mhm.
Someone feeling like I have to, I feel bad because they looking at me like, oh, you don't want to spend time. And it's not about you, it's about what I'm doing. So all of this is like the pressure. So I thank
Yeah.
you for this because I feel like it's not me by myself. It's
Right.
community. So I don't feel crazy.
Right. 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 Yeah. So I want to just like emphasize what and validate what you just mentioned, right? That it is important to set boundaries when you're noticing that like you can't do the things that maybe everybody's used to you doing or being as present, and that you have to protect maybe your study time or your self-care time, whatever it is. Um, and one of the things about setting boundaries is that not everyone enjoys that when you set boundaries with them, right? So, I want to encourage you to, and it sounds like you're already there, that, however people respond to setting boundaries, that's not for you to manage, right? I think it's important that you let that person figure it out and have their reaction, and that you take care of you and do what you can to make sure that you're protecting your time accordingly. So I just wanted to validate that, and that yes, it's important to know your limits, your strengths, your weaknesses, all of that when you're thinking about being a high achiever as opposed to a perfectionist.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mark, I'll let you have the final word. Actually, I'll have the final word, but you get
Okay.
the second to last.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you both for, just thank you for this presentation. I mean, it really is great. And it almost feels like it should be, you should synthesize it into like a one pager and like just email it out as a cheat sheet, to like SPS student body. Because some of my mentees definitely everybody's saying the same thing. And it's only going to get worse as it gets darker and colder, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to say though that I found myself like I don't necessarily feel stressed, but that's probably a bad thing, right? Because this is like the new normal, you know what I mean? It's like um I got into this habit of having overlapping endpoints. It's like I finished this, okay, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna finish this. And it's just there's no end, right? And it just keeps going.
Mm,
And then when you realize that you can maintain that level, you're like, oh, I'm gonna learn something else. You know, I gotta do something else because like when I finish this, I'm gonna be really upset if I don't know this. So yeah, and so it's like that cadence.
mhm.
But really it's that new normal, asking yourself, what is am I being lazy? Like if I wake up in the morning and I'm not tired as hell, am I lazy? Right? If it's midnight, you know, and I'm not looking for something else to do, am I lazy? You know, right? And like I'm just gonna leave the light on in the room so that when I wake up I can get back to work, you know, that kind of deal. You know, so anyway, thanks a lot for this. Appreciate it.
No problem. I would say there's something about asking yourself, am I being lazy? You know, I feel like it's like within that question, it's already kind of like judgy, like, right? So, you know, I don't know what would be for you, right? A good way to like maybe reframe checking in with yourself at those
But you
moments.
know, wait, did I say am I being lazy? No, I meant to say
Or,
why am I being lazy?
oh,
Like
why?
why am
Oh,
I being lazy?
so even more judgy, right? So I would just like to encourage you to kind of think about me if there's another way that you can check in on yourself, right? When it's, you know, when you wake up and you're not bone tired, right? What would I like to do right now, right? What do I think would be, you know, something that would be helpful for me to do or nice for me to do, or even if it's care or it's work or school or whatever it is. But you know, again, like I don't know your story and all of that, so I'm not sure if this is a helpful reframe, but there's something about telling the self I'm being lazy or why am I being lazy or am I being lazy? It just holds a kind of critical, you know, connotation that then, as we talked about with that harsh inner critic, right? That then can like spill over into other things, right? Because again, you can be a high achiever and not have to be mean to yourself, right? So, you know, just something food for thought. Maybe just shift how you're asking yourself, you know, in these moments and checking in with yourself. You can do that in a way that is neutral or even nice, you know, or positive.
Thank you, Tashelle. We had one question. Tashelle, will you be sharing the presentation for this session?
Um, I can like create like a handout or something. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can do that.
Okay.
It
Great.
might take me a day or two, so
Problem.
I might not be able to send it like immediately, but I can like try to synthesize as much as I can, and I'll maybe provide it to Reshma and they can
Yes.
send it to everyone. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
More than happy to. Well, thank you everyone for joining tonight's session. I did want to make a note on the inner critic piece. So I have a friend who's working with their therapists, and their therapists asked them to bring their inner critic outside and sit with them and have a conversation with them. And so you're speaking to your inner critic as if they're a person.
Mhm.
And they had to give this inner critic a name. And this person named it their auntie because their auntie is very critical, and in Brown families, aunties tend to be very critical, and it's said to be a joke, but um, I think it was very helpful for me when they told me that story because I started doing it in my own way, where I bring my inner critic out and I speak to
Mhm.
it like it's a person. Um, and just have a gentle conversation because that inner critic also needs to be nurtured just in a different way. Um,
Exactly.
but yeah, I thought that was very helpful and I hope it helps all of you. But thank you for joining today's session. I hope that you all use this workshop to create healthy relationships with your aspirations and wherever you choose to go in your journey, both personally and professionally. And of course, a huge thank you to our presenter, Tashelle, for providing her time and energy to the session, and we appreciate you for this and all the sessions you've done for us before. Before we leave, our next workshop is next month on November 4th. It is very different from this one. It's Breaking the Cycle, Food Justice, Sovereignty, and Social Equity. And we hope that you will join us to learn more about food justice, especially in the month of Thanksgiving. I'll drop the link in the chat. And once Tichelle provides me with that handout, I will be able to share that with you all. Thank you so much for your time. And I love the energy in the chat, very loving. I really enjoy seeing that all of you supporting each other and all of you feeling supported. This is a very shared experience for many of you, I can tell. So thank you again. And I hope you all have an enjoyable night, have some great dinner, and a restful night.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you. Good night.